Dear listeners, welcome to the channel. Today we focus on one of humanity's oldest stories. This is the Epic of Gilgamesh. We embark on a journey toward the world's first great heroic narrative. Now, dim the lights. Pull your blanket over you. Slowly close your eyes. Immerse yourself in this story from the oldest lines of history. We are starting now. The first light of morning began to appear on Uruk's stone walls. Mesopotamia's wide plain was still silent. A city rose between the converging branches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This city witnessed the early era of all humankind, not just a king or its people. Imagine standing in the cool morning in the shadow of the city walls. You could smell the ancient times embedded in the stones. The sun had not yet risen. However, the night was already long gone. There was a balance between the gray tones of the sky and the earth. This balance was also reflected in the daily life of Uruk's people. Uruk was not an ordinary city. Its name had become a symbol of trade, temples, and colossal walls. Houses built from mud brick lined the narrow streets, leaning against each other. Some houses had flat roofs. In the early morning, children or young people continued to sleep on these roofs. During the scorching summer heat, the roofs served as the only cool shelters. Wide fields stretched outside the city walls. Barley, wheat, and date palm trees provided the main food sources for the people. The river was a source of both abundance and concern for Uruk's people. A flood of the Tigris could bring rich harvests in one year. However, in another year, it could cause a serious disaster. That morning, some of the temple officials had already woken up. They had special rituals that began before sunrise. The Eanna Temple was the city's most magnificent structure. This temple, dedicated to Inanna, was not merely a place where offerings were made. It also functioned as the city's economic and administrative center. Priests and priestesses entered and exited the temple with clay tablets in their hands. They kept records of barley sacks and processed debt ledgers. Writing first emerged here to regulate human life. This seemingly sacred temple was also the center for accounts, measurements, and debt records. In the silent morning of Uruk, a peasant family appeared in the shadow of the walls. The father prepared his plow to go to the field. Oxen waited behind this simple wooden tool. The oxen would plow the field and aerate the soil. The mother prepared her small children for the day. She offered one a dry date and gave another a piece of barley bread. One of the children began to cry because of the bread's hardness. However, the mother consoled him by stroking his head with a soft voice. This small scene was a reflection of daily life from thousands of years ago. Patience, continuous effort, and the struggle for survival formed the basis of this life. As you walked toward the city center, you heard different sounds. In one corner, potters were at work. They kneaded the clay, then shaped it with their hands and left it to dry in the sun. On another street, stone masons were busy repairing walls. Each one paid attention to the finest detail of their work. Uruk's walls were not only a source of security, but also great pride for the people. When Gilgamesh's name was mentioned, the people first remembered these magnificent walls. These walls symbolized a strong bond between gods and humans. However, Gilgamesh himself was not yet present in this scene. He was a king. He was also felt like a shadow over his people as a demigod. Uruk's people knew very little about his daily life. Some said he had just woken up from sleep in the palace. Others narrated that he went outside the city with the first light of dawn to quietly meet with the gods. These rumors superseded the truth in the minds of the people. Gilgamesh was not an ordinary figure. Even speaking about him made people feel they were closer to the world of the gods. Yet this morning, your attention focused on another point. Behind the Iana temple, an old scribe was walking with heavy steps. He held a clay tablet in his hand. However, his foot tripped on a stone due to fatigue. The tablet fell to the ground. The hardened clay surface broke into several pieces. The scribe hastily bent down. He tried to collect the fallen pieces. At that moment, you noticed that the cuneiform signs on the tablet were not yet finished. Perhaps an account or prayer had been left incomplete. This scene made you ponder. What was written on this broken tablet? Was it a debt record? Or was it a supplication to the gods? Furthermore, why was he here alone at this early hour of the morning? The people of Uruk generally did not notice the scribes. They moved like shadows and spent hours over their tablets. However, without scribes, the city's order could quickly unravel. Accounts kept in a priest's mind could easily be forgotten. But a sign carved into a tablet could endure for hundreds of years. Thus, clay tablets began to carry not only the city's daily affairs, but also humanity's first stories. Perhaps the first seeds of Gilgamesh's epic were sprouting in the hands of a scribe, in the silence of such an ordinary morning. The city continued to awaken. The sounds of sheep came from in front of the gates. Women carried heavy water jugs, balancing them on their heads. Children played in the streets, building imaginary houses with small pieces of clay in their hands. Each of these scenes might seem insignificant to your eyes. However, consider this. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would find these clay pieces that the children played with. They would call them toys. In fact, things considered ordinary would transform into an extraordinary source of information in the future. As morning progressed, the sun began to illuminate Uruk's stone walls. The shadows of the high walls fell upon the streets. People sought refuge along the walls to stay in the shade. The heat was increasing. However, daily life continued uninterrupted. The scent of incense spreading from the temple mingled with the smell of fire from the potters' workshops. Amidst all this ordinariness, you could not help but ask yourself one question. This city, these people, these scribes, and these children. For how long would their stories be remembered? What were the unfinished signs on that fallen tablet actually trying to convey? As morning advanced in Uruk, the shadows began to shorten. Activity in the small square in front of the temple noticeably increased. A group of merchants began to display goods they had brought from other cities. These goods were not only brought for barter, they also carried the scent of distant lands. There were cedar wood shavings from Lebanon. Copper ingots extracted from the mountains of Iran were also present. Obsidian stones brought from Anatolia were there as well. All these products were not directly used in the daily life of Uruk's people. Nevertheless, these goods represented the city's splendor and the king's power. The riches of different lands were brought inside Uruk's walls and redistributed from there. Walking through the crowd, you saw a group of slaves carrying heavy sacks on their backs. These people were usually not called by their names. They had been captured in wars and torn from their homes. Now they were assigned to daily tasks within the city's stone walls. As you looked at their tired faces, you could feel the invisible labor behind Uruk's power. Not a single word escaped their mouths as they carried the sacks. Only their footsteps and deep breaths were heard. Even their silence contributed to the city's order. Imagine sitting in a small room in the center of Uruk, where scribes and priests stacked clay tablets. The air in these rooms was not cool at all. As the sun rose, even the stone walls absorbed the heat. The scribes continued to carve signs with their reed styluses. These tablets contained records of debts, goods, and offerings made to the temple. These seemingly boring signs were actually building the memory of a civilization. If these records did not exist, who could remember who owed how much? Who could track which family delivered how much barley or dates? The silence of a scribe was sometimes more effective than a king's sword. A king's anger could subside after one day. However, signs carved into a tablet could endure for generations. Did the people of Uruk know this truth? Perhaps they did not. They only saw the scribes carrying tablets as shadows. But today, you knew that those shadows established the city's true order. As you walked a little further in the city streets, you saw women gathered around a well. They had heavy water jugs on their heads. However, the expression on their faces was patient. They waited in line at the well. Some whispered among themselves, talking about their children and their neighbors' illnesses. A laugh occasionally arose, but then silence returned immediately. Time flowed slowly at the well. The water these women carried was not just a necessity used in their homes. It was also like a vital fluid feeding the city's veins. As the weight of the jugs burdened their shoulders, the life of the entire city was carried in their steps. As noon approached, a sound rose from the temple. Priests were preparing animals to be offered as sacrifices to the gods. A special sheep had been chosen. This sheep's fleece had been carefully combed, and flowers adorned its neck. This sight might seem strange to your eyes. Yes, the animal to be sacrificed was decorated like this. However, for the people of Uruk, this was an ordinary scene. They believed that everything offered to the gods should be the most beautiful. As the priests prayed, the crowd fell silent. Some bowed their heads, others merely watched from a distance. Every step of this ritual was slow and extremely careful. The gods certainly did not tolerate carelessness. But your eye was caught by something else. On the edge of the crowd, a young child carefully followed the priests. He held a small piece of clay in his hand. You noticed that he was scribbling something on it with a reed stylus. Perhaps he was trying to write down what he saw. The signs were not yet complete. Perhaps they were wrong, or perhaps they were incomplete. However, this small effort recalled the first lines of a future epic. Perhaps that child was among the first generation who would one day carve Gilgamesh's story onto tablets. At that moment, a simple but profound question came to mind. How many stories began with such ordinary curiosity? How many epics took their first breath with a child's observations? As the midday sun rose, the city's stones grew warm. People began to seek shade. Along the walls, in front of gates, and under date palm trees, everyone felt the slowing effect of the heat. The potter's hands began to move more slowly on the clay. The blacksmith's breaths struggled to match the rhythm of the bellows. But life did not stop. Uruk's people continued their work patiently. Life was a cycle repeating every day. In the mornings, water was carried. In the afternoons, fields were worked. In the evenings, families gathered at the same table. There seemed to be nothing extraordinary within this cycle. However, you knew that humanity's first epic would rise from within this ordinariness. Nevertheless, a slight unease was felt within the city during the midday hours. Various rumors circulated. Whispers spread that King Gilgamesh was behaving very harshly towards his people. Some said that he forcibly conscripted young men. Others claimed that he forcibly summoned young women into his service. It was said that he took women to his palace. Some claimed that he was fulfilling a divine duty. People believed the king acted this way. He sought to protect his people from the wrath of the gods. These rumors remained unconfirmed. Yet, their very existence created deep anxiety among the people. How long could a city's tranquility last? As whispers circulated in the narrow streets of Uruk, the city's daily life gained a different meaning. The bread a mother gave her child was no longer merely a display of maternal love. This showed how the king's decisions permeated daily life. The small size of the bread hinted at a major issue. A large portion of the produce went directly to the palace. The palace's power made itself felt through shortages on the people's tables. You could feel this silent unease woven into the city's fabric. Numbers on scribes' tablets ensured order. Words in priests' prayers maintained it. Units in merchants' bags also helped keep order. However, these elements also revealed the strict rules of this order. On one side, offerings dedicated to the gods ascended. On the other, dry pieces of bread were given to children. This balance was re-established every day. Nevertheless, the people did not know how long this order would last. In the afternoon, when the sun reached its highest point, activity began outside the walls of Uruk. Peasants working in the fields slowly carried their produce into the city. Sacks of barley, baskets of dates, and goat's milk gathered before the gates. These were among the various foods brought in. Gate officials checked these goods carefully. They recorded on their tablets how much was delivered to the palace. At that moment, you realized Uruk's power was multifaceted. It lay in the protection of its walls against external threats. It also resided in the records controlling internal trade. Beyond the walls, a completely different life existed. Shepherds grazed their flocks along the Tigris River. They waited for the animals to drink. They wore simple woolen clothes. Their sandals met the bare ground. Their lives differed greatly from the city's priests. Their days began and ended with the rhythm of the flock. Nevertheless, they remained an integral part of the royal power. As you watched the city for one entire day, the same idea constantly revolved in your mind. All these people were different elements of a common story. Priests with their prayers laid foundations. Scribes with their signs did the same. Peasants with their plows and shepherds with their flocks also contributed. They were all building a world to be known by Gilgamesh's name. However, most of them would not have their own names recorded. Their voices would live only in a child's cry, a mother's silent patience, or a shepherd's daily tunes. Yet, all these voices formed the backdrop for the great epic to be written in the future. As the city's shadows lengthened again in the afternoon, the scent of incense once more rose from the temple's depths. The priests concluded their rituals with evening prayers. The crowd fell into a deep silence. When the gods' names were mentioned, no one dared to raise their voice. The people believed the gods were present everywhere in the heavens. Thus, faults also became apparent everywhere. This belief created both a sense of security and a threat. Just then, a whisper was heard from within the crowd. Some whispered that King Gilgamesh had entered the temple. However, you did not notice him. Some claimed to have seen him personally. Others thought these rumors were merely illusions. Even a king's invisibility felt like a heavy weight on the people. You could not help but wonder. You questioned how a king's name permeated the daily lives of the people so deeply. At that moment, you realized this truth. Even if Gilgamesh was not visible, every action in Uruk was identified with his name. As the day gently shifted westward, the streets quieted again. Children ended their games. Mothers lined up water jugs. Shepherds brought their flocks into the city. The city once again settled into tranquility. This silence differed from the morning's calm. Morning brought the quiet of a beginning. Evening brought the serenity of day's end fatigue. In this silence, you wondered if Uruk's morning was truly ordinary. Or was it the first sign of a great epic to come? Mornings beginning in the shadow of Uruk's walls often unfolded in a routine cycle. However, beyond the city's ordinary flow, one question deeply troubled the minds of the people. Who was Gilgamesh? Was he a king or a being from the divine realm? This question echoed in the whispers of women carrying water in the streets. It also occupied the minds of peasants plowing fields. It could even be sensed in the lip movements of priests praying in the temple courtyard. As you sat near the walls, you could feel how this question permeated the city's atmosphere. A child asked his father, "Was King Gilgamesh truly a god?" After a brief pause, the father stated his belief. King Gilgamesh was a semi-divine being. He was also a human like themselves. This answer completely surprised the child. What did it mean to be a demigod? This was a concept simple people could not grasp. Gilgamesh's mother, Ninsun, being one of the goddesses, held great importance for the people of Uruk. Ninsun's name was associated with sacredness. She was considered the embodiment of wisdom and intuition. The people believed the qualities Gilgamesh inherited from his mother signified his power. His father, Lugalbanda, was a human and the king of Uruk. Thus, Gilgamesh was born with both divine and human origins. He was a child of two realms. Therefore, the people followed his every step with admiration and deep awe. As you walked among Uruk's stone walls, you could see how the people perceived this dual identity. Some sought refuge in his power. They thought Gilgamesh was a shield protecting the city from divine wrath. However, others feared his power. They said the king had received much from the gods. However, he also demanded much from them. To be a demigod meant being both a savior and an oppressor in the eyes of the people. A priest serving in the temple often had an important phrase written on his tablets. The king was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. This expression was ingrained in the minds of Uruk's people. However, you could not help but question this idea. How could a human be measured by the proportions of gods? Did the people truly grasp this ratio? Or was it merely a repeated phrase for them? Gilgamesh's dual identity was evident not only in people's minds. It was also apparent in daily life. One morning, young men gathered in front of the palace. They looked at his power with admiration. Gilgamesh possessed an imposing stature, broad shoulders, and determined steps. He was more majestic and strong than a normal human. His lifting one stone alone was equivalent to a task 2 normal humans would struggle with. This scene evoked admiration. However, it also created a shudder. No one could foresee where such limitless power would lead. Inside the palace, however, a different atmosphere prevailed. Gilgamesh's administration contained a harshness based on his divine power. Uruk's young men were often compelled to work on his construction projects. People's labor was used for these jobs. Young women were sometimes invited to the palace against their will. They were forced to live under the king's patronage. Although the people questioned these practices, they dared not voice them openly. The king was not just a ruler. He was also a representative of divine will. As you watched the people's silent acceptance, new questions began to emerge in your mind. Did Gilgamesh's divine side truly protect the people? Or was it further restricting their freedom? As Uruk's walls rose, did the people feel safer or more enslaved? Uruk's daily life proceeded under the influence of this dual identity. As the potter sold his jug, he was reminded of one thing. The king's name should not be forgotten. As the shepherd led his flock to water, people spoke of their powerful king. They said he was as mighty as the gods and observed them constantly. Even children used the king's name in their games. Thus, Gilgamesh ceased to be merely a figure residing in the palace. He became an influence present even in the people's daily words, actions, and games. However, this influence was not always peaceful. The words a woman whispered to her neighbor summarized the contradiction in the people's hearts. The people accepted that their king was powerful. However, they also stated that they felt the weight of his power. This sentence was like an invisible echo traveling through Uruk's stone streets. Being a demigod was not limited to Gilgamesh's personality alone. This situation was also a truth woven into the people's destiny. As you listened to this story, you asked yourself inwardly, could a human possess both divine and human characteristics? If so, would that person's power be used to protect the people? Or would it be used to test them? As the day progressed in Uruk's stone streets, Gilgamesh's dual identity became even clearer in the eyes of the people. In the early morning, mothers offered food to their children. At noon, farmers toiled in the fields. In the evening, religious officials worshipped in the temple's shadow. All carried the burden of their lives along with his name. His being 2/3 divine and 1/3 human functioned as an invisible balancing element in every aspect of daily life. This was because the people could not foresee which aspect of this identity they would face at any moment. One day, a large construction site was created near the walls. The king had decided to further strengthen Uruk's walls. He invited the city's young men to work. This situation was a reflection of the king's dual nature. Although the walls appeared as a symbol of divine protection, they were actually built from the bodies and labor of the people. A peasant observed that their king displayed divine power to them. Moreover, they carried the burden of that power with their own hands. This idea echoed throughout the construction site. No one dared to voice an objection. However, a similar thought prevailed in everyone's mind. It was a matter of curiosity. Was divine power truly used for the people's good? Or was it to prove the king's own immortality? The sound of stones rose from the construction site. Reeds were stuck in the mud. The breaths of young workers were heard. On their faces, both honor and fatigue were evident. They knew they were building walls that would go down in history. However, they also felt that the heavy burden on their shoulders was stealing from their lives. This contradiction reflected the impact of Gilgamesh's identity on the people. Uruk's women also experienced the king's shadow. Some young women were summoned to the palace. They were forced to become Gilgamesh's favorites. This situation aroused a hidden anger among the people. However, no one dared to speak openly. This was because Gilgamesh's divine attribute made his actions unquestionable. Some claimed that if the blood of the gods flowed in his veins, his desires were also divine. This thought pushed the people into a helpless acceptance. Nevertheless, the unrest in the women's eyes was visible. This showed the most bitter face of the king's dual nature. In Uruk's temple, a different situation prevailed. Priests interpreted Gilgamesh's power as a grace bestowed by the gods. According to them, the king's 2/3 divine nature made Uruk superior to other cities. The priests engraved on clay tablets that the king carried out the gods' commands. The writings stated that the people lived under his protection. As these words were repeated in the people's minds, they transformed into truth. Writing immortalized what was said. However, considering these tablets, another question arose. People questioned if these writings truly expressed the public's feelings. They wondered if the writings reflected the order desired by the priests. History was often recorded through the words of the powerful. But where was the silence of ordinary people? Later in the day, a child played in the narrow streets of Uruk. He had built a small castle from mud, lining its perimeter with stick walls. The child proudly declared himself king and shouted that no one could breach his wall. The other children laughed, but joined the game. This small scene showed Gilgamesh's influence penetrating even the dreams of children. His name echoed not only in the priests' prayers, but also in the children's games. Thus, his divine identity intertwined with daily life. It took root in the minds of future generations. As evening approached, the shadows of the city walls lengthened. A new rumor spread as the people tried to shake off the day's fatigue. It was said that Gilgamesh went outside the walls very early in the morning to speak with the gods. No one had seen this, but everyone wanted to believe it. Such a rumor further reinforced his divine aspect. However, it also rendered his human side invisible. The people never knew his loneliness. No one learned what he thought during his morning walks. The questions he asked himself remained unknown. As all this unfolded, one question lingered in people's minds. If a king truly became a demigod, would his power benefit the people? Or would the people be condemned to be crushed under the weight of that power? As dusk slowly settled over Uruk, questions repeated throughout the day continued to echo in the minds of the people. They questioned Gilgamesh's true identity. Was he their king or an envoy of the gods on earth? This question was woven into the ordinary details of daily life. As the potter's kiln cooled, the shepherd's flock entered the fold. The mother returned home with her water jar. All were part of this dilemma. In the stone courtyards of the temples, priests prepared for night prayers. Incense burned, and rising smoke stretched towards the heavens to attract the attention of the gods. One of the priests carved an inscription onto a clay tablet. He stated that the king carried the power of the gods in his veins and protected his people. These lines were not an expression of fact, but rather a declaration of belief. The hearts of the people wavered between believing these words and hesitating. Some truly saw the king's power as a blessing from the gods. However, others quietly sensed the weaknesses of his human side. In the narrow streets of Uruk, an old woman told her grandchild ancient stories. She said that she remembered the king's childhood. The woman stated that those times were also different. No other child was as strong as he was, but in his eyes, there was a loneliness unique to humans. The grandchild listened in astonishment. For the grandchild, the king was merely a figure seen above the walls. He was a shadow never seen up close, but his name constantly echoed in the child's ears. What this old woman recounted was among the rare testimonies. These stories shed light on Gilgamesh's one-third human side. Within the high walls of the palace, another silence reigned. Gilgamesh's night walks were moments the people wondered about but did not know. According to rumors, he gazed at the stars at night, trying to read the signs of the gods. No one had ever seen these moments, but for the people, imagining was enough. It was believed that a demigod king could not be ordinary even at night. Even his silence carried a divine meaning. However, perhaps this silence stemmed more from human loneliness than from divinity. When children in the streets of Uruk abandoned their games and fell asleep, only the barking of dogs was heard in the city's darkness. But the silence continued in the minds of the people. Everyone felt the impact of the king's dual nature on their own lives. For some, it offered security. For others, it was a heavy burden. Some were proud of his divine power. Others painfully experienced the harshness of his human side. As all these scenes unfolded, one question remained in people's minds. When a person belonged to both gods and humans, was this identity truly a bridge? Or did it create a loneliness trapped between two sides? This question, echoing through the stone streets of Uruk, applied not only to the people of that era, it was also relevant for all of history. For power and weakness, holiness and ordinariness have always coexisted in humanity's journey. As Uruk's stone walls rose, a completely different world stretched beyond the city. The organized streets of civilization, the incense smells of temples, and the scribes' clay tablets ended here. They gave way to endless pastures, the tracks of wild animals, and the silent, blowing winds. For the people of Uruk, this region was mostly spoken of with fear. Beyond the city walls, nature's own order prevailed. Right in the middle of that order, Enkidu's story began. In the eyes of the people, Enkidu had been created by the gods. However, as Enkidu's story was heard, this creation could be imagined differently. Perhaps he had grown up in the lap of nature, far from other humans. His bare feet touched the earth, his hair swayed in the wind, and his eyes followed the movements of animals. His food consisted of small animals he hunted or wild plants he found. He drank water from the currents of the Tigris River and slept under the stars at night. His life was simple. Yet, it was also full of nature's hardships. There were no traces of civilization on Enkidu's body. He did not use pottery, did not bake bread, and did not know how to write. He ran his hands over the soil, searching for food by reading animal tracks. Most of the time, he ran with gazelles, grazing alongside them. This suggested he existed somewhere between human and animal. When the people claimed he was sent by the gods, perhaps they were only trying to explain this difference. For a city person, someone living so close to nature could not be an ordinary human. The shepherds of Uruk sometimes saw him while grazing their flocks. When they saw someone kneeling in the grass, drinking water with animals, they first felt fear, then curiosity. "Who is this?" they whispered. They wondered if he was human or something else. However, no one dared to approach him, because this stranger, appearing as a child of nature, also represented an unknown. Enkidu's silence harmonized with the rhythm of nature. He awoke when the morning sun rose, followed animal tracks, and lay on the grass as the evening sky darkened. In his life, there were no clay tablets, no prayers of priests or merchants' bags. Despite this, there was an order in his own world. Perhaps for those outside civilization, true strength lay in adapting to nature itself. Imagining Enkidu's life, the calluses on his hands, the dust in his hair, and the watchful gaze in his eyes became clear. He patiently waited for his prey to satisfy his hunger. When a rabbit stirred in the grass, Enkidu held his breath. He tried to catch it with a stone or a simple stick. When successful, this small victory was enough to save his day. When he failed, he had to spend the night hungry. Thus, Enkidu's world was like a constant test. For the people of Uruk, this lifestyle was almost incomprehensible. For them, life was organized according to the gods' commands. Life gained meaning through temples, tablets recording debts, and the security provided by the walls. But Enkidu lived outside this world. He relied only on the strength of his own body and nature's generosity. This made him seem like a threat to the city's order. His existence raised the question of whether humans could live without a city. One day, a shepherd took his flock to the banks of the Tigris River and saw Enkidu more closely. He noticed Enkidu grazing with the sheep. This sight was both frightening and strange for the shepherd. Because for the city dwellers, a human drinking from the same source as animals was a humiliating act. But for Enkidu, this was a natural action. He saw animals not as rivals, but as companions. The shepherd recounted this event when he returned to Uruk. People found it difficult to believe his words. They asked how a human could live alongside animals. But rumors spread rapidly. Everyone began to speak of this strange outsider. Some said he had been sent by the gods. Others believed he was a cursed spirit. Thus, Enkidu's name entered the public's discourse, even though he was not seen in the streets of Uruk. One could sense how these rumors grew. In a city, the fastest spreading thing was sometimes curiosity, not news. As people discussed Enkidu's existence, they were also questioning their own order. Because the city had been built to separate humans from animals, the walls kept not only external enemies but also nature itself at bay from within. But now, the name of a human who emerged from nature echoed within these walls. This created an invisible crack in the minds of the people. In Enkidu's world, however, everything operated differently. He understood the change of seasons from the movements of animals, the direction of migrating birds, the yellowing of grass, and the receding of water had become his calendar. He did not carve his days onto tablets like the people of Uruk, but carried nature's signs in his memory. These signs ensured his survival. Perhaps they were more reliable than the records of civilization, for nature forgot nothing in its own cycle. At night, Enkidu gazed at the stars, while the city's priests interpreted these stars as signs from the gods. For Enkidu, they were merely lights in the sky. This was a way to find direction. Perhaps this was the simplest expression of the difference between human and God. In the city, stars carried a divine meaning. In nature, they merely showed the way. However, one wonders, did Enkidu feel lonely while lying under the stars? Or was the silence he shared with animals a sufficient companionship for him? In the eyes of the people of Uruk, Enkidu was a figure half human and half wild. However, when his life was closely examined, humanity's first steps were recalled. Because once, all humans lived like him. Before cities, temples, and tablets existed, people lived intertwined with nature and alongside animals. Enkidu was like a living legacy of the past. His existence brought to mind the rising walls of Uruk. Humanity could exist independently of civilization. However, this idea disturbed the city dwellers. The city people had found safety and a divine order within the walls. Enkidu's presence made them question this security. Some wondered if the order desired by the gods was outside the city. Therefore, Enkidu became both a captivating and threatening figure for the people. As these scenes were observed, a single question arose in people's minds. Was Enkidu truly a wild outsider? Or was he a silent reminder of an ancient way of life that humanity had forgotten? Outside the walls of Uruk, Enkidu lived in the silence of nature. His name continued to spread in the whispers within the city. The shepherd's stories merged with the accounts of merchants. The priests in the temple also interpreted these events. Few had seen him. However, the number of those who heard increased daily. These rumors triggered the curiosity of the people of Uruk. A human living like a child of nature was trying to cross the boundaries of their known world. One day, one of the shepherds could no longer resist. He wanted to see Enkidu up close. While grazing his flock, he saw Enkidu from a distance. Enkidu was running with the gazelles. Afterward, he knelt by the water and drank with them. The shepherd silently watched Enkidu. He saw a human being. However, this person's behavior completely resembled that of animals. This sight both surprised and puzzled the shepherd. In the city, people managed and owned animals. But Enkidu lived with animals and regarded them as equals. When the shepherd returned to Uruk, He recounted this event. People listened to him carefully. Some laughed, others were afraid. However, this news held great importance, especially for the priests. Uruk's order rested on the distinction between humans and animals. The difference between city and nature, divine and ordinary, was significant. Anything that blurred this distinction was seen as a threat to the existing order. One of the priests carved a message onto a clay tablet. The message stated that the child of nature wandered outside the walls. Its arrival, they said, could shake the order in the city. This inscription further increased the rumors about Enkidu. A certain idea began to spread among the people of Uruk. If Gilgamesh truly was a king who was 2/3 divine, perhaps the gods had sent him an equal. This idea slowly took hold in the minds of the people. Gilgamesh's power was felt more deeply each day. His demands burdened the young men. He also forcefully interfered in the lives of women. Perhaps the gods had sent this wild child to balance Gilgamesh's power. This thought left the people caught between hope and fear. The shepherds saw that Enkidu caused no harm to the herds. They understood that he posed no direct threat. However, his presence still altered the animals' behavior. The sheep did not fear him when they saw him. In fact, they approached Enkidu. This situation was a strange sign for the shepherds. Normally, animals were expected to flee from strangers. The silent bond Enkidu formed with them was not something an ordinary human could achieve. In time, the priests and scribes decided that this stranger needed to be brought to the city. His continued presence in nature threatened Uruk's order. Integrating Enkidu into civilization would satisfy the people's curiosity. Furthermore, it would divinely reinforce the king's power. A plan was thus formulated for this purpose. One of the shepherds consulted with the priests at the temple. The priests decided to send a woman. It was not possible to bring the child of nature by force. An enticing reason was needed to draw him into civilization. The woman represented one of civilization's most powerful symbols. The woman sent was one of the temple priestesses. However, she was no ordinary priestess. These women, serving in the temple, represented the will of the gods through sacred unions with men. This was a sacred ritual for the people of Uruk. Now this woman would confront Enkidu. Their encounter was more than just a meeting of two people. It was also the first confrontation between nature and civilization. The woman went out beyond the city walls with the shepherds. They waited for Enkidu for days. Finally, they noticed a stranger grazing with the animals. The woman advanced silently. Then she sat among the grasses. Enkidu noticed the woman. This was the moment where nature's silence met human curiosity. Enkidu was cautious at first. However, the woman smiled at him. She offered him water and bread. Enkidu drank the water. He tasted the bread. Perhaps he was doing such a thing for the first time in his life. The daily food of the city dwellers was a foreign taste to him. For days, the woman accompanied Enkidu. She tried to separate him from the animals. By talking and touching, she showed him different aspects of humanity. Enkidu slowly drifted away from the animals. He no longer ran with the gazelles nor drank water beside them. Instead, he sat in the shade with the woman and ate bread. This change marked the first step in introducing the wild child to the city. However, this step also brought a loss. Enkidu realized that his bond with the animals had weakened. One day, when he tried to drink water with the herds, the animals moved away from him. They no longer saw Enkidu as one of their own. Enkidu was bewildered, yet he understood the situation. He no longer belonged to his old world. With the woman's arrival, the child of nature had slowly entered the path of civilization. For the people of Uruk, This news sparked great curiosity. When the woman returned, she explained that Enkidu was no longer with the animals. The people were both surprised and joyful in their reaction. This was a clear sign that the child of nature had crossed into civilization. The priests declared this to be the will of the gods. They stated that nature had submitted to humanity. However, as this story was heard, a different idea emerged. Perhaps it was not submission, but merely a process of isolation. Enkidu had lost his place among the animals, yet he had not been fully accepted among humans. This scene recalled a very ancient transition in human history. It evoked the shift of nomadic communities to an agricultural way of life. The drawing of someone living with animals into the walls was also a turning point. Enkidu had become a small representative of humanity's great change, which would span thousands of years. As people listened to this story, they wondered about one thing. When Enkidu was truly drawn into civilization, would this be a gain for him? Or was it a loss, severed from the freedom of nature? The woman's patient presence and the bread and water she offered became a turning point in Enkidu's life. For days, he had run with the animals. He drank water with them and adapted to nature's silent rhythm. This man had now become acquainted with human-specific customs. Bread was not just a new taste for him. It was also the door to a new world. For bread was the result of the collective labor of city dwellers. Barley from the fields, soil plowed with an ard, fire burning in the oven, and dough kneaded by women were products of this labor. All of these were parts of a system Enkidu had never seen before. However, Enkidu's bond with the animals had weakened. After spending a few days with the woman, he tried to run with the gazelles again. But he saw the animals moving away from him. In their eyes, he was now a stranger. Herds that once approached him when he knelt by the water now hesitated and kept their distance. Enkidu struggled to understand this at first. However, he soon realized the truth. He was no longer part of the animals' world. He had stepped into the human world, severed from the animal realm. This situation marked the beginning of a profound loneliness for him. The woman spoke to Enkidu about Uruk. She told him about massive stone walls, temples, and large groups of people. Enkidu listened carefully to the woman. These descriptions seemed magical in his eyes. For the largest structures he had seen in his life were rocks or tall trees provided by nature. Now, she spoke to him of walls that people raised to the sky with their own hands. This thought created both curiosity and apprehension in Enkidu's mind. For a wall was a structure that both protected and limited at the same time. The woman decided to take Enkidu to the city. As they set out, they slowly moved away from nature's silence. Dirt paths gave way to stone-paved roads. When the walls of Uruk appeared on the horizon, Enkidu slowed his steps. This sight was extraordinary for Enkidu. Such massive structures, built by human hands, carried a different meaning than natural stones. Here, power was not in the muscles of animals or the cycles of nature. It lay hidden in the collective labor of humans. When they arrived at Uruk's gates, the people gathered with curiosity. In their eyes, Enkidu had been merely a figure of rumor. Now, he stood before them in reality. His long hair fell over his shoulders. His body bore the marks of the bare earth. His eyes were wild, but he also observed his surroundings with profound attention. People looked at him with both admiration and apprehension. Some said that he was a sign sent by the gods. Others whispered that he could bring disaster to the city. As Enkidu entered the city, his eyes fixated on every detail around him. The clay potters molded with fire, the bronze smiths hammered, and the signs scribes carved onto tablets caught his attention. Each of these was both a strange and a fascinating sight for Enkidu. To eyes accustomed to the natural order of animals, this order seemed almost miraculous. Yet Enkidu also felt like a stranger within this new order. The people of Uruk approached Enkidu with both curiosity and reserve. Children circled around him. However, they dared not come too close. Women secretly watched him, but they avoided eye contact. The men, meanwhile, looked at him as if trying to gauge his strength. According to rumors, Enkidu was someone who ran with animals in nature. Therefore, his strength far surpassed that of an ordinary human. This thought inspired admiration in some. For others, it became a source of jealousy. The temple priests called Enkidu inside to see him. For them, this figure was a sign from the gods. If he truly had been sent by the gods, his arrival in the city must carry an important message. The priests greeted him with prayers. However, Enkidu struggled to understand their words. Such prayers did not exist in his world. The names of the gods were hidden in the silence of animals and the murmur of the wind in his life. These people standing before him now seemed to have confined the gods to stones, tablets, and incense. This situation was a contradiction difficult for Enkidu to grasp. As Enkidu wandered through the streets of Uruk, he found himself in a dilemma. He had been severed from nature's freedom, yet he did not fully belong to the human order. His walk seemed both powerful and strange to the people. His way of eating, drinking water, and even his gaze were different. This difference both made him special and alienated him. Enkidu struggled to find his place among people. In time, Enkidu's strength began to be discussed in the city. He displayed extraordinary abilities even in ordinary tasks. He lifted heavy stones by himself. He helped the shepherds in controlling animals. Moreover, he easily ended conflicts. This power made him even more significant in the eyes of the people. However, it also attracted the attention of King Gilgamesh. For in Uruk, the power of only one person could be accepted. This power belonged to the king himself. As Enkidu continued to stay in the city, he felt his inner loneliness more acutely. He had lost his connection with the animals. Yet his bond with humans was not yet complete. Children did not understand his games. The priests could not interpret his silence. Women found his gaze to be strange. Enkidu remained caught between two worlds. He could neither remain completely a child of nature nor become a city dweller. This inner conflict posed a profound problem for him. He slept at night in the shadow of Uruk's stone walls. He would gaze at the stars in the sky. During his time with the animals, the stars were merely guides. But now, the loneliness he felt under those stars had grown. He could find neither the companionship of animals nor the full acceptance of humans. The people of Uruk perceived Enkidu's arrival as a sign. Some believed he was a balancer sent by the gods against Gilgamesh. Others thought he brought a threat that would disrupt the city's order. Nevertheless, everyone agreed that he was no ordinary person. His strength, distinctiveness, and natural past aroused curiosity in Uruk's streets. This situation had become an important topic of discussion in the city. Enkidu's inner dilemma was felt by everyone. He had grown up with nature's tranquility. He had experienced friendship with animals. Now, he was alone among tall stone walls. Enkidu's story reflected humanity's struggle between the ancient and the new. As cities grew, the sounds of nature diminished. The feeling of freedom weakened as people sought security. Enkidu was a symbol of this significant transformation. This situation raised an important question in people's minds. Does a person truly grow stronger when they break their bond with nature? Or do they become even lonelier by stepping into civilization? This presented a dilemma. The stone walls of Uruk shimmered under the scorching sun. However, a growing unrest prevailed in the hearts of its people. The city's daily life seemed orderly from the outside. Potters worked skillfully by the fire. Blacksmiths hammered bronze into shape. Merchants carried their goods to the market. Yet, beneath this order lay the overwhelming power of King Gilgamesh. His name was heard everywhere. It echoed in children's games, in the prayers of priests, and in the songs of shepherds. However, the weight of this name eventually became a burden for the populace. Young men were used for wall and construction work by royal decree. Some remained away from their homes for months. Their hands became calloused from carrying stones under the sun. Young women were also frequently summoned to the palace. They entered the king's service against their own desires. The people were disturbed by these compulsions. However, they could not openly voice their concerns. This was because Gilgamesh was not merely a ruler. He was a figure with divine blood. To defy him meant to defy the will of the gods. However, a new name was now being spoken among the people. This name was Enkidu. He grew up in the embrace of nature. He lived alongside animals. Then, rumors spread that he had met humans. This rumor quickly gained traction. Some saw him as a balancing force sent by the gods to Gilgamesh. This idea added a secret hope to the growing dissatisfaction of the people. The people desired the appearance of someone equal in power to Gilgamesh. Enkidu began to be seen more and more in the streets of Uruk. His large physique both fascinated and intimidated the people. His gaze, coming from the wild, deeply affected them. His power, beyond that of an ordinary human, was evident. Children would circle around him, yet they hesitated to approach him too closely. Women secretly observed him. Men compared themselves to him. According to one rumor, Enkidu could topple a bull alone. Another legend claimed he easily drove away animals that challenged the shepherds. These rumors strengthened the idea that he could be Gilgamesh's equal. Priests and scribes closely followed this development. Gilgamesh's rule was unquestionable to them. However, there was a stranger believed to be sent to Uruk by the will of the gods. His presence could mark the beginning of a new era for the city. Important lines were inscribed on clay tablets. They stated that the king had found a companion to share his power. The gods had brought two people together. This phrase spread among the populace and gained even greater meaning. Enkidu still felt like a stranger in the city. He longed for the days he spent in the tranquility of nature. However, he could not return to the world of animals. He was not fully accepted among humans. The streets of Uruk meant loneliness for him, even in the crowd. On the other hand, the power within him pushed its limits within the city's stone walls. Perhaps Enkidu's destiny was not to remain between nature and the city. Perhaps he would bring these two different worlds together. One day, a great rumor began circulating among the people. Enkidu would confront King Gilgamesh. This rumor was whispered in the marketplace and in the temple courtyard. These talks also spread in the shadow of the city walls. People looked at each other with curiosity. They wondered if this would truly happen. For the people, this encounter was not just a meeting of two strong men. It was also the manifestation of the gods' will. If Enkidu was Gilgamesh's equal, this would provide new hope for the people. A large crowd gathered in the dusty streets of Uruk. Two massive figures met in a square surrounded by the people. Gilgamesh emerged proudly from the palace. Royal majesty rested on his shoulders. Enkidu, however, came from nature. Traces of wildness were visible in his gaze. This encounter had already become a legend in the minds of the people. However, how this epic would begin was still uncertain. The people of Uruk continued their daily tasks while awaiting the confrontation. Yet, behind every action, the excitement of the approaching moment was palpable. The potter kneaded his clay while listening intently. The shepherd herded his flock, his eyes fixed on the city gate. Even the priests pondered the sacred meaning of this confrontation as they recited their prayers. All life in the city was invisibly focused on the intersecting paths of these two men. In Enkidu's inner world, there was a different kind of tranquility. He had lost the freedom offered by nature. However, he could not fully find a place in the city either. Perhaps his destiny was companionship. Human loneliness never fully ends, neither in nature nor in the city. Perhaps only a bond forged with another person could lessen this loneliness. Uruk's demigod King Gilgamesh would stand before him. When these children of two different worlds met, would they be enemies? Or would they sow the first seeds of a friendship that would become history? The rumors that had been circulating in the streets of Uruk for days would finally become reality. The people had heard that Gilgamesh and Enkidu would face each other. This news was spoken loudly in the marketplace. It spread in whispers in the temple courtyard. It even blended into the songs of the shepherds. All eyes in the city awaited the approaching moment. This confrontation was not an ordinary fight or a coincidence. In the people's minds, it resembled a test where the will of the gods would be revealed. On that day, the stone streets of Uruk were more crowded than usual. People left their homes. They gathered in front of their doors. Children climbed the walls. Women waited in the shadows. Men advanced towards the squares. Everyone's expectation was the same. The entire city wanted to see the stranger who would confront Gilgamesh. When Gilgamesh emerged from the palace, his guards walked slowly beside him. His posture carried the majesty of a king. A crown, representing divine power, rested on his head. He wore an elaborately embroidered garment. In his hand, he held a scepter, a symbol of his might. His presence was more than that of an ordinary human for the people. Gilgamesh stood in the square with all the splendor of a demigod. Enkidu, meanwhile, appeared from the shadow of the city walls. He wore no ornate royal clothes. His hair fell freely over his shoulders. His body bore the marks of a nature. His power did not stem from clothes or symbols. This strength was evident in the muscles of his body and the determination in his gaze. A great silence fell when the people saw the two figures standing side by side. This sight was like the opening of a new act on the stage of the gods. Gilgamesh approached Enkidu with a sharp gaze. At that moment, the people held their breath. This gaze was directed at someone challenging the king's authority. Enkidu, however, did not retreat. He had come from the tranquility of nature. Fear was a foreign emotion to him. In this confrontation, his eyes reflected equality rather than acknowledging the king's power. The people did not hear the first words. However, the language of their bodies was more powerful than words. As Gilgamesh stepped forward, Enkidu responded. Two imposing figures confronted each other in the middle of the square. People began to whisper. They believed the gods were watching them. Then the fight began. This was no ordinary brawl. Gilgamesh attacked with the honor of a king. Enkidu, like a child of nature, responded with his instincts. The sounds of their bodies clashing echoed through the stone streets. The people watched with great excitement. Some predicted Gilgamesh would win. Others admired Enkidu's strength. Minutes felt as long as hours. Both warriors were exhausted, but neither gave up. Finally, a surprising event occurred in the midst of the fight. The two men stopped, looking at each other. Their breaths were ragged. However, they saw the same thing in each other's eyes. This was an equality that pushed the limits of power. At that moment, the fight began to transform into a friendship. For a person could only conquer their loneliness by finding someone equal to themselves. The people witnessed this event with astonishment. They had hoped the fight would end with a victory. However, the gods had prepared a different outcome. This was the mutual recognition of two powerful individuals. Gilgamesh grasped Enkidu's hand. This gesture was not a defeat, but an acceptance. In the eyes of the people, this moment was a sign from the gods. Gilgamesh's power was no longer alone. A friend, his equal, stood beside him. The priests interpreted this development. Important records were inscribed on their tablets. It was written that the king had found a companion to share his power. The gods had brought two people together. This line was etched into the memory of the people of Uruk. This moment was not just a fight. It was the beginning of one of humanity's greatest friendships. However, a dilemma still existed within Enkidu's inner world. He had left the tranquility of nature. Now he stood beside the king in the city. This situation gave him a new position. However, it also completely distanced him from his former life. At night, while gazing at the stars, he recalled the days he lived with animals. During the day, walking beside Gilgamesh, he became an important figure for the people. For Gilgamesh, this confrontation had built a bridge between pride and loneliness. This event was a turning point. For years, he had made his divine power felt by his people. However, he now found an equal before him. This situation initially led to anger within him. It then brought a sense of relief. Even a king needed a friend to share his deep loneliness. The people of Uruk wondered what consequences this friendship would bring. Some believed it would make the city stronger. Two powerful individuals now stood side by side. Others worried that this union would lead to new challenges from the gods. The coming together of two powers could create greater difficulties instead of strengthening order. This story leaves you with a question. Is true friendship the merging of two powers, or is it the mutual recognition of two solitudes? When the fight between the two men stopped in the middle of the square, the people of Uruk were still silent. They expected a victor or a vanquished. However, what they saw went beyond this expectation. Gilgamesh and Enkidu looked at each other, breathless. In their eyes, instead of anger, there was a respect born of recognition. This respect gave birth to something new within the walls of Uruk. This thing was friendship. The people continued to tell the story of that moment even years later. It was one of the greatest signs the gods had shown on earth. It was two strong men becoming friends instead of enemies. When Gilgamesh clasped Enkidu's hand, it was not merely a greeting. It was the meeting of two worlds. It was the union of the city and nature, of the divine and the human. It was also the point where power and loneliness intersected. The next day, a different atmosphere pervaded the streets of Uruk. The people spoke hopefully of this new friendship. The potters spoke in low voices as they went about their work. The king was no longer alone. The shepherds discussed among themselves as they herded their flocks. Perhaps the gods were preparing them for a new era. The women also debated. Enkidu's presence might soften the king's harshness. These words reflected a great expectation among the people. They believed that friendship would change the king's rule. For Enkidu, this friendship held new meaning. He was lonely during his days with animals in nature. He was a stranger in the city. However, he had now found a place beside Gilgamesh. Their equal strength allowed both of them to accept their own limits. This was the first time for him to feel the power of a bond. At night, gazing at the stars, he no longer felt lonely. He had a strong and different person beside him, just like himself. For Gilgamesh, too, this friendship had a transformative effect. For years, he had ruled his people alone. He had experienced the loneliness that came with being a demigod. Power had often been a great burden for him. However, Enkidu's presence had brought a friend to share this burden. Gilgamesh could speak with Enkidu. They could even argue with each other. They often sat together in silence. This was a rare situation for a king. Powerful individuals usually remained alone. The people wondered about this friendship. They questioned what it would bring to their city. Some believed the two men would challenge the gods together. Others thought their friendship would make the city more just. However, an unchangeable truth emerged. In the stone-paved streets of Uruk, two names were now spoken together. These names were Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Temple priests offered their own interpretations of this event. According to them, it was part of the gods' great plan. A line was carved onto the clay tablets. This line stated that the gods tested loneliness with friendship. As this message spread, the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu became a divine sign. However, silent questions also lingered in the shadow of this friendship. If two powers united, would this union only offer hope for the people? Or would it challenge the gods? The people of Uruk did not know the answer. They only lived what they saw. They left the rest to the gods' judgment. As Enkidu walked the city streets, people greeted him very differently. Children looked at him without hesitation and with admiration. Men showed him respect. They no longer compared their strength to his. Women began to see wisdom in his quiet demeanor. This was a sign of the bond he formed with Gilgamesh. This bond deeply affected the people. Gilgamesh welcomed Enkidu into his palace. He saw him as a friend who sat beside him. He was not just an ordinary stranger. This changed the entire atmosphere of the palace. The king now had an equal voice at his side. This voice often brought balance instead of harshness. At night, the two men climbed the walls of Uruk together. They would gaze upon the city. They watched the lights rising from the people's homes. They also listened to the sounds carried by the wind. They did not speak much during these moments. However, even their silence held meaning. This was because two lonely souls could share quietude together. For the people of Uruk, this friendship began a new story in the city. For them, everything could now change. Perhaps the king would become more just. Perhaps the gods were preparing them for greater trials. The most important thing for the people was this friendship. It united power with loneliness. As you listen to this story, you might ask yourself, can friendship truly change the world? Or is it just a temporary comfort? Does it only ease people's loneliness? In the shadow of Uruk's stone walls, Gilgamesh and Enkidu grew stronger in their friendship. The people now spoke their names as if they were one. For potters, shepherds, women, and priests, this union was a sign from the gods. However, an uncertain curiosity also lingered. They wondered where the two men would go together. The joining of two great powers often brought new challenges. It was not always just security. One day Gilgamesh spoke with Enkidu in the palace's stone courtyard. He gazed into the distance. He declared that Uruk's walls were strong. However, their strength was not meant only to remain within these walls. He stated that the gods had not drawn boundaries for them. They were created to go beyond these limits, he said. Enkidu remained silent at first regarding this idea. Then he took a deep breath. He told Gilgamesh that he knew the forest very well. In his childhood, he had gone to the foothills of those mountains. He journeyed there with the wild animals. The howling of the wind, the creaking of the trees, and the dark shadows were all there. Everything in that place felt very different. Even the sun seemed to lose its power upon entering the forest. The breath of Ba could be felt among the branches. It was not easy for anyone who went there to return. His words were a warning, filtered from the memory of nature's child. However, determination shone in Gilgamesh's eyes. Gilgamesh declared that fear was not meant to stop them. Instead, he stated that fear existed to be overcome. He added that if they did not challenge Ba, their names would remain confined to these walls. On the contrary, they were not ordinary people living in the shadow of the gods. They were destined to be etched into history. When the people of Uruk heard the king's intention, they felt a mix of excitement and astonishment. Some called it madness. They believed no one could oppose Ba. Others thought perhaps this was something the gods desired. The people associated Gilgamesh's every action with the divine. If he made such a decision, it surely had a divine reason. The priests discussed the meaning of this journey. For them, Ba was more than a creature. He was a symbol of the gods' boundaries. If Gilgamesh and Enkidu crossed this boundary, it would be a challenge. It would be more than just courage. A line was carved onto clay tablets. This line stated that their king was preparing to force open the gate. This gate was protected by the gods. This expression showed both fear and admiration. Enkidu saw his friend's determination. He suppressed the conflict within himself. He knew the power of nature. However, he had also chosen to walk beside Gilgamesh. Friendship had broken his old loneliness. Now, as a bond of friendship, he would embark on this journey with him. This preparation was discussed for days in the streets of Uruk. Potters wondered if the two men would truly go into the forest as they worked. Shepherds, while gathering their flocks, spoke of Ba. They said even his breath brought death. Women sat their children on their laps. They prayed for the gods to protect them. These rumors stirred both fear and curiosity among the people. They realized they were witnessing a significant turning point in history. Finally, preparations for the journey began. Gilgamesh had spears and axes prepared in the shadow of the walls. Enkidu, however, brought nature's wisdom with him. He knew which herb could reduce poison. He also knew under which tree they could rest. The two men combined knowledge from very different worlds. These preparations revealed an ancient balance within humanity. It was the balance of power and wisdom. It was the balance of city and nature. It was also the balance of courage and fear. The people of Uruk watched these preparations in silence. Some prayed, others shed tears. However, everyone knew that this journey would change the city's fate. This was not merely the courage of two men. It was also an expedition that would spread Uruk's name throughout the world. As you listen to this story, you might ask yourself this question. Was true courage an absence of fear? Or was it the ability to take action despite fear? Rumors that lasted for days in the stone streets of Uruk finally turned into preparation. Gilgamesh and Enkidu decided to go to the cedar forest. The people watched them with both fear and admiration. This was not an ordinary expedition. It was a step taken towards the gods' boundaries. In the palace courtyard, armors were polished, spear tips were sharpened, axe handles were strengthened. However, The preparations involved more than just weapons. Enkidu took with him the knowledge he had learned in nature. He knew which plant would suppress hunger. He also knew which leaf would relieve fatigue. Enkidu knew how to quench thirst throughout the desert. He also knew which stream's water was safe to drink. Gilgamesh carried the symbol of kingship with him. The prayers and expectations of the Uruk people were also with them. On the day they set out, the people of Uruk gathered at the gate of the city walls. Women prayed with palm branches in their hands. Children tried to peek through the crowd with curiosity. The elders bowed their heads in silence. They could not predict the outcome of this journey. Some believed the two men would return victorious. Others thought this journey represented a point of no return. However, everyone knew this moment would be unforgettable in the city's history. Gilgamesh spoke loudly before the people. He said they would not surrender to fear. He stated that the gods had given them power. He explained that they would demonstrate this power beyond all boundaries. He added that Uruk's name would not remain only within these walls. He emphasized that it would also echo in the depths of the forests. His words ignited a fire in the hearts of the people. Some could not hold back their tears. Others raised their heads to the sky and prayed. Enkidu maintained his silence. A determined expression lay on his nature-bound face. He knew the dangers of this journey. However, the bond of friendship prevented him from expressing his fear. Enkidu had chosen to walk beside Gilgamesh. Now they would step into the unknown together. As they set out, Uruk's stone walls remained behind them. A long and arduous road stretched before them. The sun rose over the fields. The wind swayed the barley stalks. Shepherds watched their flocks from a distance. Villagers lifted their heads as they tilled their fields. They looked at the two passing figures. These were no longer ordinary men. They were the walking steps of a legend. This journey was a great trial that would last for days. During the day, an oppressive heat prevailed. At night, the coolness brought by the wind dominated. As they advanced through the desert, the stones beneath their feet burned like fire. Enkidu could find the safe path. He followed the tones of the earth and plant traces. Gilgamesh advanced with unyielding determination. His steps carried the desire for immortality, not the burden of kingship. One day they discovered a small stream by the roadside. Enkidu knelt and tasted the water. He said the water was clear. He noted it came from the mountains. He thought they could rest there for a while. While resting, Gilgamesh watched the waters flow. He realized that no matter how powerful they were, they could not change the water's direction. However, he noted that humans had learned to direct this flow. They did so with walls and channels. He said their own power came from shaping nature's strength. These words reflected Gilgamesh's human thought. They went beyond his demigod identity. When night fell, the sky filled with stars. Enkidu silently gazed at the sky. For him, the stars were a guide from nature. Gilgamesh perceived them as signs from the gods. The two friends found different meanings in the same sky. This reminded them of their different origins. Nevertheless, they sat around the same fire and shared the silence. Friendship allowed different views to coexist. As the journey progressed, the traces of the forest became more distinct. In the foothills of the mountains on the horizon, the shadows of dense woodlands appeared. The wind no longer carried only dry dust. It also brought the rustling of leaves. When Enkidu heard this sound, he took a deep breath. He said they were approaching their destination. This was not an ordinary forest, he stated. He added that the shadows were different here. He explained that even breathing became difficult. Gilgamesh, however, responded with determination. He said they were in the right place then. He emphasized that history was not written in ordinary places. He stated that their names would be carved into the heart of this forest. As they moved away from Uruk, the people's prayers were left behind. However, their echo remained in the minds of the two friends. This journey was not just for two men. It was part of the fate of the entire city. The people in their homes dreamed of their steps. Children enacted courage in their games, becoming Gilgamesh or Enkidu. This journey left a mark even in the dreams of the people. One night as they approached the forest, the wind's howling changed. The sounds coming from the leaves were not like an ordinary breeze. Enkidu lifted his head and listened carefully. He said it was Humbaba's breath. They had not seen him yet, but they could feel his presence. Gilgamesh remained silent. He felt a shiver within him. At the same time, he felt a great desire. Fear and courage touched his heart simultaneously. As you listen to this journey, you might ask yourself this question. Does a person truly conquer their fear when stepping into the unknown? Or do they learn to walk alongside their fear? The two friends had moved away from the stone walls of Uruk for several days. They finally arrived at the entrance of the cedar forest. Behind them were dirt roads, the scorching sun, and small streams. The landscape before them was different from anything they had known. A unique density and weight prevailed here, found nowhere else on Earth. Cedar trees rose high towards the sky, their branches intertwined, almost completely blocking the light. The sun tried to penetrate the trunks, but it only reached the ground in faint streaks. The air was heavy, and moisture collected on the leaves in droplets. The scent of moss was noticeable with every step. Enkidu raised his head and looked carefully. He stated that this was not merely a forest, but a place under the protection of the gods. Gilgamesh ran his hands over the cedar trunks as he advanced. The tree's bark felt like a test in his eyes, strong enough to support cities and resilient enough to challenge them. His voice held a clear sense of defiance, not fear. Enkidu, knowing the language of nature, remained more cautious. He stated that every power carried its own balance. He warned that once they entered this balance, they would be tested not only by their own courage, but also by the eyes of the gods. As they stepped into the forest, the silence intensified. It was as if all the birds had fallen, silent, and even the winds had calmed. Only a hum could be heard moving among the trees. Enkidu closed his eyes, stating that this was Humbaba's breath. He added that even nature fell silent when Humbaba was present. Gilgamesh continued to walk. Every step was firm, as if he walked on stone streets. His inner emotions were not reflected outwardly, for he felt a shiver. Despite being a demigod, he faced human fragility against the unknown. This fragility made his courage more meaningful, for courage meant moving forward despite fear, not the absence of it. After a journey lasting for several days, descending into the forest's depths was a different test. The ground was soft, and their steps grew heavy. Tree branches covered the sky. As the light diminished, the sense of time disappeared. It became difficult to tell if it was morning, noon, or evening. For them, there was only forward movement. One night, they lit a small fire in the middle of the forest. As the fire's sparks rose to the sky, cedar trunks danced with shadows. Enkidu sat by the fire and listened silently. He said that during his days living with animals, the sounds of the forest had been his friends. But here, even the sounds felt foreign. This was not an ordinary corner of nature, but a place where the gods had set boundaries. Gilgamesh remained silent for a long time after listening to his friend's words. He then stated that this was precisely why they were there. He noted that people's names were forgotten unless they crossed boundaries. He expressed that they would transcend this limit and etch their names into eternity. His voice held not only a king's pride, but also a deep desire for immortality. For while humans were mortal, their deeds could be recounted for generations. When morning came, the forest's scent had grown heavier. The sharp smell of resin mixed with the humidity, making breathing difficult. Both felt this challenge in their bodies. Returning was no longer an option, for their strong friendship bound them to the same goal. One returning meant leaving the other alone, and both now understood loneliness very well. As they delved deeper, the forest itself seemed to be watching them. The curves in the tree trunks resembled faces from a distance. The hums from among the leaves were like incomprehensible words. This atmosphere explained why the people feared Humbaba. Everything in this forest seemed alive, and at the heart of this vitality was Humbaba, known by the name of fear. Meanwhile, the people of Uruk were talking about their journey in the city. The potter at his furnace stated that the heroes were deep in the forest. The shepherd, while tending his flock, imagined the wind bringing their footsteps. Women whispered, as they put their children to sleep, that everything would change upon their return. Even in their absence, everyone in the city felt this journey as part of their own lives. As Gilgamesh and Enkidu advanced deeper into the forest, the sky completely disappeared. Tree trunks rose like a wall, branches intertwined, blocking all paths to the sky. Time flowed differently here. Every step carried the weight of hundreds of years. This forest was not an ordinary place, but one that held the memory of the past and the gods. One night, the wind blew harder. The rustling of leaves seemed to turn into thousands of whispers. Enkidu raised his head and listened carefully, stating it was Humbaba's voice and that Humbaba knew they were present. Gilgamesh looked into his friend's eyes. At that moment, both felt fear alongside a great determination, for they knew they could not turn back. As you listen to this story, you might ask yourself a question. Does one truly grow stronger when stepping into the heart of fear? Or does one merely redefine their fear with a new name? The sun rising over Uruk's stone walls spread a new wave of joy into the city. The people encountered a sight they had not seen for a long time. Gilgamesh and Enkidu were returning from the cedar forest. The journey's difficulty was etched on their faces, and weariness was in their bodies. Yet the sparkle of victory could be read in their eyes. Behind them were cut cedar logs, a silent testament to Humbaba's defeat. When the people saw them, they rushed to their doors with joy. Women brought out date wine from their homes, children ran with flowers, clearing a path for them, and men bowed respectfully. These two friends had not only defeated a creature in the forest, but had also transcended the boundaries of fear. For the people of Uruk, this victory was like a sign that even the gods would recognize. Priests burned incense in the temple courtyard. Clay tablets recorded that their king and his friend had defeated fear. However, an unnoticed unease lay in the shadow of these joyous days. The gods did not always view human courage as a simple limit. Sometimes, excessive human pride could draw their wrath. Gilgamesh and Enkidu's victory was seen by the people as a step towards immortality. In the eyes of the gods, however, this could be a challenge that pushed boundaries too far. In the streets of Uruk, women and men began to tell new stories. Children reenacted courage in their games, no longer playing just Gilgamesh, but Enkidu as well. The people, by mentioning the names of these two friends side by side, wove a new epic into the city's memory. However, whispers began to circulate among the priests. Would the gods be pleased with such praise? Would order be disturbed if human names were spoken with the same weight as the gods' names? These questions were quietly asked with deep concern. In the stone courtyard of the palace, Gilgamesh proudly listened to the cheers of the people. In their eyes, he was not just a king, but also a hero. Enkidu stood beside him, silently watching the crowd. This joy was a strange feeling for Enkidu. He was unaccustomed to such noisy admiration, yet his friend's presence kept him calm.